Sometimes, the only reason you're still alive is because someone else heard the danger before you did. The town would later say they heard a deep, hollow thunder roll through the valley that morning, the kind that didn't echo right, the kind that felt like it came from beneath the earth instead of the sky. But when they looked toward Ethan Cole's house, all they saw was silence and a thin ribbon of dust drifting into the pale winter air, and no one could quite explain why the man who should have been inside wasn't there anymore. 24 hours earlier, the road into Blackridge had been quiet. Just a narrow strip of cracked asphalt winding through frozen pines and low hills dusted with snow. The kind of place people passed through but rarely stopped in, and Ethan's old pickup moved slowly along it, tires crunching against gravel, as if even the truck remembered this place and wasn't sure it wanted to return. He hadn't been back in over a decade, not since the call that changed everything, not since the night his father's voice disappeared from the world and left behind a house full of questions no one could answer. And yet here he was again at 40 years old, broader now, quieter, carrying the weight of years that had taught him how to survive, but not always how to rest. Beside him sat Atlas, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick coat of gray and sable that caught the morning light in soft streaks, his ears high, his amber eyes fixed not on the road ahead, but somewhere deeper, as if listening to something Ethan couldn't hear. The house came into view slowly, rising at the end of a long dirt drive lined with dead grass and broken fence posts, a 2-story structure with faded white siding and a porch that leaned just enough to feel tired, like it had been waiting too long for someone to come home. Ethan cut the engine and let the silence settle, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but full, pressing in around him with the weight of memory. And for a moment, he just sat there with his hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the place where he grew up, the place he swore he'd never return to, the place that still held pieces of him whether he wanted them or not. Atlas didn't move at first, then slowly, his ears twitched, his head tilting slightly toward the house, not curious but focused, like a soldier hearing a distant signal. And when Ethan finally opened the door and stepped out into the cold air, the dog followed close, paws crunching softly against the frost-covered ground, his body tense in a way that didn't match the quiet surroundings. The wind drifted through the trees with a low whisper, brushing against the siding of the house and slipping through the loose boards with a faint, hollow sound. And Ethan felt it then, that strange, familiar sensation he couldn't quite name, like the place itself was aware of his presence, like it had been waiting. He walked toward the porch, each step slow, measured, the wood creaking under his boots as he climbed the steps, and Atlas stopped just short of the doorway, his gaze fixed on the dark interior beyond the threshold, his chest rising and falling in steady, controlled breaths, not fear, not exactly, but something close enough to make Ethan pause. "It's just a house," Ethan muttered under his breath, more to himself than the dog, reaching for the handle, the metal cold against his fingers. And when the door finally opened with a long, tired creak, the air inside felt different, heavier somehow, carrying the faint scent of dust, old wood, and something else he couldn't place, something buried beneath the years. Atlas stepped in slowly, one paw at a time, his nails clicking softly against the worn floorboards, his ears rotating, tracking something invisible, and Ethan followed, closing the door behind them as the light shifted and the shadows inside the house seemed to settle into new shapes, as if adjusting to their presence. And somewhere deep within the structure, too faint to notice at first, something gave a subtle, rhythmic tremor, like a heartbeat hidden beneath layers of wood and time, steady, patient, waiting. The house did not welcome him, but it did not reject him either. It simply existed in a quiet, watchful way that made every step inside feel like it mattered. And Ethan moved slowly through the narrow hallway, his boots stirring thin layers of dust that had settled over the years like forgotten snowfall, each footstep echoing softly against the walls as if the place remembered how sound used to travel when voices still lived here. Atlas stayed close at first, his shoulder brushing against Ethan's leg, but then something shifted in the dog's posture, a subtle tightening through his spine, his head lifting slightly as his ears angled toward the far end of the house, not toward a door or a window, but toward the floor itself. And Ethan noticed it without fully understanding, the way a soldier notices a change in the air before knowing why. The The living room still held the same worn couch pressed against the wall, the same stone fireplace with its darkened interior, and the same shelf where his father used to keep old radios and tools that never quite worked the way they should. And for a moment Ethan stood there, letting the memories rise and pass through him like a slow current. Not painful, not anymore, just distant. Like something that belonged to another version of himself. Atlas moved ahead, his nails tapping in a steady rhythm across the wooden boards, then stopping abruptly near the center of the room, where the light from the window fell in a pale square across the floor, and he lowered his head, nose hovering just above the surface, not sniffing in curiosity, but holding still, listening, as if the wood beneath him was speaking in a language only he could hear. Ethan watched him, arms folded loosely, trying to shake the feeling that had been building since they stepped inside. That quiet sense that something here was not quite finished, not quite settled. And when Atlas let out a low breath, not a growl but something deeper, almost thoughtful, Ethan felt it in his chest more than he heard it. "What is it, boy?" he asked softly, his voice barely carrying through the room. But Atlas did not look up. He simply shifted his weight and placed one paw firmly against the floor, then another, pressing down as if testing something beneath the surface. And that was when Ethan noticed it. Not a sound exactly, not at first, but a faint sensation under his boots, a subtle vibration that came and went so gently it could have been mistaken for imagination, except it returned, steady and measured, like a distant pulse. He took a step closer, crouching slightly, his hand brushing across the worn boards where the grain had faded with time, and for a moment everything else faded with it. The wind outside, the quiet of the house, even the memories, leaving only that rhythm beneath his palm, faint but undeniable, repeating at an interval that felt too precise to ignore. Atlas lifted his head then, his amber eyes meeting Ethan's with a clarity that needed no explanation, and in that silent exchange something passed between them, not fear, not urgency, but recognition, the kind that comes when instinct speaks louder than reason. Ethan straightened slowly, glancing toward the front door, the truck still visible through the window, the open road waiting just beyond it, and he knew he should leave, that this place had already taken enough from him years ago, that nothing good came from digging into what was buried. But his feet did not move, because Atlas had not moved, and the dog's stillness carried a weight that was hard to ignore. Somewhere deep within the structure, the faint tremor came again, just strong enough this time to ripple through the floorboards and vanish, like a breath drawn in and held, and Ethan exhaled slowly, unaware that the house had already begun counting something neither of them could yet see. The rhythm did not stop once he noticed it, and that was what unsettled Ethan the most. Not its presence, but its consistency, as if something beneath the house had its own quiet sense of time, something patient and steady that had continued long before he arrived, and would continue long after he left. And he found himself standing there longer than he intended, listening without realizing he was listening, his breath slowing to match the stillness around him. Atlas shifted again, but this time, there was no hesitation in his movement. He stepped in a slow circle over the same patch of floor, then stopped with precise certainty and tapped once with his paw, not scratching, not digging, just a deliberate motion that carried meaning. And when he looked up at Ethan again, his gaze was sharper now, more insistent, as if whatever he sensed had grown closer, clearer. Ethan exhaled through his nose and rubbed a hand along his jaw, the faint stubble catching against his palm as he tried to piece together something logical, something grounded. But logic did not settle easily in a place like this, not when the air itself felt layered with years of things left unsaid. He turned toward the wall where his father used to keep a row of tools, most of them gone now, but a single rusted crowbar still leaned in the corner as if it had been waiting for a purpose that never came. And for a moment Ethan just looked at it, knowing exactly what it meant to pick it up, knowing that once he started digging into the past, there would be no clean way to put it back. Atlas let out a soft, low sound again, not impatient, not anxious, but steady, like a reminder rather than a warning. And that was enough. Ethan stepped forward, took the crowbar in his hand, and returned to the center of the room, the wood beneath his boots creaking in quiet protest as he positioned the tip against the seam between two boards that looked no different from the rest, except now he knew better. He hesitated, just for a second, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his shoulders, then pressed down, the wood giving with a dry crack that echoed through the room, louder than it should have been. Or maybe it only felt that way because of how still everything else had become. The first board lifted slowly, releasing a faint breath of colder air from below, air that carried a metallic edge and something older, something sealed away for too long, and Ethan leaned back slightly, not in fear but in recognition, the kind that comes when something hidden begins to show itself. Atlas stepped closer immediately, lowering his head toward the opening, his ears forward, his entire body aligned toward whatever lay beneath, and Ethan crouched beside him, pulling the board back further until a narrow gap revealed darkness below, not empty darkness but depth, the kind that suggested space where there should not have been space at all. The vibration came again then, stronger. This time, traveling up through the exposed gap and into Ethan's hand where it rested against the wood, and he froze, counting without thinking, the old instinct returning from years of training. 1 second, 2, 3, until it faded, then silence again, then the quiet wait for it to return. He swallowed slowly, his throat dry now, and glanced at Atlas, who did not move, did not look away, only listened. And Ethan understood something in that moment that he could not fully explain, that whatever was beneath them was not random, not harmless, and not finished. He shifted his weight and stood, stepping back from the opening as the house seemed to settle around them with a faint, almost imperceptible creak, like an old structure adjusting its posture, and his eyes drifted toward the front door again, toward the pale light outside, toward the simple choice of walking away before this became something else entirely. But Atlas moved first, stepping between Ethan and the door, not blocking him completely, just enough to pause him, enough to say without words that leaving now might not mean safety. And somewhere beneath the floor, the rhythm began again, quieter this time, but no less certain, as if whatever was waiting below had just become aware that it was no longer alone. The air in the room felt different after the floor opened, thinner somehow, as if the house itself had exhaled something it had been holding for years, and Ethan stood there for a long moment, the crowbar still in his hand, his eyes fixed on the narrow gap beneath the boards while his mind worked through possibilities he did not fully trust. Because none of them explained the rhythm, none of them explained why it felt so deliberate. Atlas remained at the edge of the opening, his body angled. Forward but steady, not reckless, not fearful, just aware, the way he had been trained to stand when something mattered, and Ethan recognized that posture instantly. The same quiet readiness he had seen in the field when the dog had detected something long before any human signal could confirm it. The vibration came again, softer this time, but closer, traveling up through the exposed space and into the wood around it. And Ethan felt it not just through his boots, but through the air itself, a faint shift that made the room seem to tighten for a second before releasing again. He crouched once more, slower now, setting the crowbar aside and placing both hands on the floor as if grounding himself in something real, something solid, and he leaned closer to the opening, his breath steady but controlled, listening the way he used to listen in places where silence meant everything. The darkness below did not remain empty for long. As his eyes adjusted, he began to make out shapes, not clearly, but enough to understand that there was space beneath the house, more than a crawl space, something deeper, something structured, and the faint outline of what could have been old support beams or framing suggested this had been built with purpose, not accident. Atlas lowered his head further, his nose just inches from the gap, then pulled back slightly, not in fear but in decision, and stepped to the side, circling once before returning to the exact same spot and placing his paw down again, firmer this time, as if marking it as the center of something important. Ethan followed that instinct without question now, reaching forward to pry at the next board, the wood resisting at first before giving way with another sharp crack, and as the opening widened, a colder draft rose from below, carrying a faint metallic scent that lingered in the back of his throat, not strong enough to alarm, but present enough to matter. He paused again, listening, and this time when the rhythm returned, it carried a subtle echo, as if the space below was amplifying it, reflecting it back in a way that made it clearer, more defined, and Ethan's mind moved quickly now, connecting patterns, counting intervals without effort, The training he thought he had left behind slipping back into place like it had never left. 10 seconds, then silence. Then another faint pulse, not mechanical exactly, but not natural. Either, something in between, something that felt constructed but forgotten. Atlas shifted again, this time stepping back from the opening and turning toward Ethan, his ears still alert, but his posture changed, less focused on the floor and more on him, as if the message had shifted from discovery to warning. And that was when Ethan felt it too, not beneath him but around him, a subtle change in the air pressure, a quiet tension that made the walls seem closer than they had been a moment before. He stood slowly, his eyes moving across the room, taking in the windows, the door, the structure itself. And for the first time since stepping inside, he considered not what was hidden below, but what might happen above. The house creaked softly, a long, low sound that ran through the beams and faded into silence, and Atlas took 2 steps forward, positioning himself directly between Ethan and the center of the room, his body firm, unmoving, his gaze steady and unblinking. Ethan did not argue with that. He did not question it, because somewhere deep in his instincts, something older than thought was already responding, already calculating distance, time, and exit, and he took a slow step backward toward the front door, his hand lowering slightly as if ready to move faster if needed. The rhythm beneath the floor paused, just for a moment, and in that stillness, the entire house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something neither of them could yet see. And Atlas did not break his stance, because sometimes the difference between leaving and not leaving is only a few seconds, and those seconds rarely announce themselves twice. The stillness did not last, it never does, and Ethan felt the shift before he understood it, a subtle tightening in the air that pressed against his chest like a warning that had no voice. And Atlas reacted first, his body snapping from stillness and emotion as he stepped forward and pressed firmly against Ethan's leg, not nudging, not asking, but insisting, his weight deliberate and unyielding in a way that carried urgency without panic. Ethan did not resist, not because he fully understood, but because there are moments when trust moves faster than thought, and this was one of them. So he took another step back, then another, his eyes never leaving the center of the room where the boards had been lifted, where the darkness below seemed deeper. Now, more present, as if the space itself had begun to reach upward. The faint rhythm returned, but this time it did not feel distant. It felt closer, sharper, the interval shorter by just enough to matter, and Ethan's mind caught it immediately, counting without effort, measuring without needing to, his breath slowing as everything inside him aligned with a single instinct: move. Atlas let out a low sound, not loud, not aggressive, but firm, a signal Ethan had heard before in places where hesitation could cost more than time, and the dog stepped backward in sync with him, guiding without looking away from the center point, as if holding something there with nothing but focus. The floor creaked again, but this time it was not the tired groan of old wood. It was a deeper sound, a shifting beneath the structure, subtle but unmistakable, like weight adjusting where no weight should have been, and Ethan felt it through the soles of his boots, a faint tremor that rolled outward from the opening and disappeared into the walls. He reached the edge of the room now, the front door just a few feet behind him, the cold light outside spilling faintly through the glass. And for a brief second he hesitated, not because he wanted to stay, but because part of him still needed to understand, still needed to see what this was, what had been hidden beneath the place he once called home. Atlas did not allow that hesitation to grow. He shifted again, stepping directly in front of Ethan, and turning his body just enough to guide him toward the door, his eyes never breaking from that fixed point behind them. And in that moment Ethan realized something simple and undeniable. The dog was not reacting to what was happening. He was anticipating what was about to happen. The rhythm beneath the floor tightened again, faster now, more urgent, and the air carried a faint metallic edge that had not been there before, subtle but sharp enough to register, and Ethan's decision was made. Before he could put it into words, he reached back, his hand finding the door handle without looking, and pulled it open in one smooth motion. Cold air rushed in immediately, clean and sharp, cutting through the heavy stillness of the house, and Atlas moved with him, stepping backward onto the porch while keeping his body angled toward the interior, as if unwilling to fully turn his back on what lay inside. Ethan stepped out after him, boots hitting the worn wood of the porch, and for a fraction of a second everything seemed to pause. The wind quiet, the trees still, the world holding itself in a fragile balance. Then from inside the house came a deeper shift, not loud, not explosive, but final. A settling of something that had been under strain for far too long, and Ethan felt it more than heard it. A low, contained release that moved through the structure and into the ground beneath it. He took another step away, instinct guiding him now more than thought, and Atlas finally turned his head, his ears lowering slightly as the tension in his body eased just enough to signal that whatever moment had been approaching had already passed. Ethan stood there in the cold morning light, his breath visible in the air, his eyes fixed on the house that now looked exactly as it had before, quiet, still, unchanged to anyone who did not know what had almost happened inside. And he placed a steady hand on Atlas's neck, not in relief, not yet, but in recognition, because sometimes survival does not come from understanding what nearly happened, it comes from listening to the one who knew it would. For a long moment neither of them moved, not because there was nothing left to do, but because something in the air had shifted into a quiet that demanded respect, the kind of quiet that follows an event you cannot fully explain but instinctively understand you were not meant to be part of. And Ethan stood there on the porch with his hand resting on Atlas's neck, feeling the steady warmth of the dog beneath his palm while his eyes remained fixed on the house, searching for any visible sign that what he had felt inside had truly happened. The structure looked unchanged from the outside, the same faded siding, the same leaning porch, the same still windows reflecting the pale winter sky, and yet there was a subtle difference now. Something almost imperceptible in the way the house held itself, as if whatever tension had once been locked inside it had finally released, leaving behind a stillness that felt deeper, heavier, but no longer waiting. Ethan stepped down from the porch slowly, his boots pressing into the frozen dirt as he put a few more feet between himself and the front door, not out of fear, but out of instinct. The same instinct that had kept him alive in places where staying too close to something unknown was never the right choice. And Atlas followed without hesitation. Though he paused once at the edge of the steps, turning his head back toward the doorway, his ears tilting slightly, as if confirming that whatever signal had driven him before had now faded. The wind moved gently through the trees again, carrying the faint scent of pine and cold earth, and for the first time since arriving, Ethan allowed himself to take a full breath without holding anything back, the air filling his lungs clean and steady, grounding him in the present instead of the past. He glanced down at Atlas, studying the dog's expression, the calm alertness in his eyes, the quiet certainty in his posture, and something settled inside him then, not relief exactly, but understanding, because this was not the first time Atlas had reacted to something unseen, and it would not be the last. But this time had been different. This time the dog had not just warned him, he had guided him, step by step, away from something that had already begun to unfold. Ethan turned his gaze back to the house, his mind replaying the moments inside, the rhythm beneath the floor, the subtle shift in the air, the way everything had built toward a point he could not see but could feel, and he realized that whatever had been hidden beneath that structure had not been random. It had been there for years, maybe decades. Waiting, building, and if Atlas had not been there, if he had taken just a few more seconds to understand instead of move, the outcome would have been very different. He walked a few yards farther down the dirt path, putting more distance between himself and the house until he reached the edge of the old fence line, the wood brittle and gray from years of weather, and he rested his hand against one of the posts, his eyes still fixed on the place where he had grown up, where his father had once lived, where something had gone wrong long before he ever understood it. A quiet thought moved through him then, not loud, not urgent, but steady, the kind that does not demand attention but stays with you all the same. And he wondered if the rhythm he had felt inside had always been there, even back then. Even on the night, everything changed, hidden beneath the surface where no one thought to look, where only something like Atlas could ever truly sense it. The dog stepped closer, pressing lightly against his leg, no longer tense, no longer focused on the house, just present, and Ethan placed his hand on the dog's back again, this time with a different weight, not just acknowledgement, but gratitude, Because some warnings do not come with noise or signs or second chances, they come quietly, through instinct, through loyalty, through the one presence that chooses to stay close enough to hear what the world tries to hide. And as the morning light settled fully over the valley, Ethan understood something he had not known when he arrived. That coming back here had never been about selling the house or closing a chapter. It had been about facing something unfinished, something buried, and more importantly, it had been about walking away from it at exactly the right moment, guided by the only companion who had heard it coming before it ever reached the surface. He stayed by the fence longer than he planned, not because there was something left to see, but because something inside him had not quite settled yet, the kind of feeling that does not leave all at once but fades slowly, like the last echo of a sound you can no longer hear but still remember. And Ethan kept his eyes on the house, tracing its outline against the pale sky, noticing details he had not paid attention to in years. The slight tilt of the roofline, the way the porch sagged just a fraction more than it used to, the faint discoloration along the siding where weather had worn it down unevenly. And it struck him then how much time had passed without him noticing, how much had changed while he stayed away. Atlas shifted beside him, no longer tense, his posture relaxed now, but not careless, the kind of calm that comes after a job has been done. And Ethan glanced down at him, studying the dog's face as if trying to understand something deeper than instinct, something that could not be trained or taught. Because what had happened inside that house had not been a simple reaction. It had been timing, precise and unshakable. The kind of timing that does not come from chance. The wind carried a faint sound from somewhere down the valley, a distant truck passing along the main road. And it reminded Ethan that the world beyond this place was still moving, still turning without pause, even as he stood here caught between past and present. And he took a slow breath, letting that thought ground him again, pulling him back from the edge of memory where it would have been easy to linger too long. His gaze returned to the house, but now it felt different to look at it, not heavy in the same way, not filled with unanswered questions, but quieter, as if something that had once demanded attention had finally released its hold. And he realized that whatever had been beneath it, whatever had been building over time, it had reached its moment and passed, leaving behind only the space where it used to exist. He pushed off the fence gently and took a step forward, not toward the house, but along the dirt path that curved around it, his boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. And Atlas followed without hesitation, falling into step at his side with the easy rhythm of a companion who does not need direction to know where he belongs. As they moved, Ethan found himself glancing back once more, not out of fear, but out of respect, because places like that do not simply disappear from a person's life. They stay with you in quieter ways, in the way you listen a little closer, in the way you pause a little longer before stepping forward. The house remained still. Behind him, unchanged to anyone who might pass by, just another aging structure at the edge of a forgotten road. But Ethan knew better now. He knew that some things do not need to be seen to be real, and some moments do not need to be understood to matter. Atlas walked a little closer, brushing lightly against Ethan's leg, a simple gesture that carried more meaning than words ever could. And Ethan reached down, resting his hand briefly on the dog's back, feeling the steady strength there, the quiet certainty that had guided him when it counted most. The path led them away from the property, toward the open stretch of road where the world felt wider and less confined, and with each step, the weight he had carried into this place seemed to lift just a little more, not gone completely, but lighter, manageable, as if something had shifted into its proper place. And though he did not say it out loud, though he did not need to, Ethan understood that he had come here expecting to close a chapter, to leave something behind. But instead he had been shown something else entirely, that sometimes the past does not need to be solved or uncovered. Sometimes it only needs to be survived at the right moment, guided by the one presence that hears what others cannot. And in that quiet understanding, he kept walking, not looking back again, because this time, he knew exactly when it was time to move forward. The road curved gently as it led them away from the property, the gravel thinning into cracked pavement that stretched toward the horizon like a quiet promise. And Ethan walked without rushing, each step measured, each breath steady, as if his body was still adjusting to the absence of something it had only just begun to understand. Atlas kept pace beside him, his movements relaxed now. The tension that had once held his frame taut replaced by a calm that felt earned rather than given. And every so often the dog would glance up, not to check for danger, but simply to confirm presence, the silent communication between them settling into something deeper than instinct. The valley opened wider ahead, revealing long stretches of dormant fields and distant tree lines softened by the pale light of morning, and Ethan let his gaze travel across it, noticing how different the world felt just a few hundred yards away from the house, how the air seemed lighter, clearer, as if whatever had lingered behind him had not followed. He reached the edge of the main road and paused, turning slightly to look back, not directly at the house this time, but at the land that surrounded it, the familiar rise of the hill, the line of old fencing, the quiet stillness that now seemed almost ordinary again. And for a moment he wondered how many years that place had carried its hidden weight unnoticed, how many quiet days had passed above something that had been slowly building beneath. Atlas stopped beside him, his ears lifting briefly as if catching a distant sound, then settling again when nothing followed, and Ethan watched that small motion with a new awareness, realizing that the dog was no longer listening for what had been, but simply existing in what was, present and grounded in a way that humans often forget how to be. A pickup truck passed in the distance, its engine low and steady, and Ethan felt the world return to its usual rhythm, the kind of everyday movement that does not ask questions, does not search for meaning, but continues forward all the same. And he found comfort in that, in the simplicity of it, in the understanding that not everything needed to be explained to be left behind. He shifted his weight and stepped onto the road, the surface firm beneath his boots, and Atlas followed immediately, falling into step as if this had always been the direction they were meant to take. And as they moved, Ethan felt something settle fully inside him for the first time since arriving. Not just the absence of tension, but the presence of clarity, quiet and steady, like a thought that no longer needed to be chased. He did not need to return to the house, not to fix it, not to uncover more, because whatever had been waiting there had already reached its moment, and he had been given just enough time to step away from it. No more, no less. And that was enough. Atlas brushed lightly against his leg again, a small, grounding touch, and Ethan rested his hand briefly on the dog's back, not out of habit, but with intention, because there are some moments that change a person in ways that do not need to be spoken, moments that leave behind a quiet understanding that stays with you long after the details fade. The sky above had begun to clear, the pale gray giving way to a softer blue, and the light stretched across the road ahead, guiding it forward in a way that felt simple and certain, and Ethan followed it without hesitation, his steps steady, his mind no longer caught in the space between what had been and what might have been. And though he did not look back again, though the house disappeared from view behind the curve of the road, a part of him carried the awareness of what had happened there, not as a burden, but as a reminder that sometimes the difference between staying and leaving, between knowing and not knowing, comes down to a single moment of trust, a moment when you choose to follow the one presence that hears what you cannot. And in doing so, you walk away from something you were never meant to face alone. By the time the sun climbed higher over the valley, the road had carried them far enough that the house no longer existed in sight, only in memory, and even that memory had begun to soften at the edges, not erased, not forgotten, but placed somewhere quieter inside Ethan where it no longer demanded answers. The miles passed slowly beneath his boots, each step steady, each breath easier than the last, and Atlas moved beside him with the same quiet rhythm, no longer searching, no longer listening for something hidden beneath the world, just present in the simple act of walking forward. The town appeared gradually ahead, a small cluster of buildings resting along the road, as if it had been there long before either of them arrived, and would remain long after they were gone. Its stillness familiar in a different way, not heavy like the house, but grounded, lived in, touched by ordinary days and ordinary people. Ethan slowed as they approached, his eyes taking in the details: a gas station with a flickering sign, a diner with a single truck parked out front, a row of windows catching the morning light, and it all felt distant but real, a reminder that life continued in places untouched by whatever had lingered behind him. Atlas paused briefly at the edge of the road, his ears lifting once more, not in warning this time, but in quiet curiosity, and Ethan watched him with a faint shift in his expression, something softer than before, something closer to ease, because the tension that had defined the earlier hours had finally released its hold completely. He stepped onto the sidewalk, the solid ground beneath him carrying a different kind of certainty, and Atlas followed without hesitation, their pace slowing as they moved through the quiet street. And for the first time since arriving in Blackridge, Ethan allowed himself to feel something he had not expected to find here. Not closure exactly, but a sense of alignment, as if something that had been out of place for years had quietly returned to where it belonged. He stopped near the edge of the diner, resting his hand lightly against the wooden railing, and looked back down the road one last time, not to search, not to question, but simply to acknowledge the distance he had put between himself and that moment. And in doing so, he understood that whatever had almost happened inside that house no longer held power over him, because he had not stayed long enough for it to take shape. Atlas stepped closer, pressing gently against his side, his presence steady and unchanging, and Ethan placed his hand on the dog's head, his fingers resting there for a moment longer than usual, not out of habit, but with intention, because there are some things you do not say out loud, some gratitude that does not need words to be understood. The wind moved softly through the street, carrying with it the faint sounds of a world that did not know how close something had come to changing, and Ethan found comfort in that, in the quiet normalcy of it, in the way life continues without needing to recognize every moment that almost happened but did not. He turned away from the road then, stepping toward the diner door, not because he had a plan, not because he knew what came next, but because moving forward felt right, and Atlas followed at his side, as he always had, not leading now, not warning, just walking. And in that simple motion there was a truth Ethan finally understood, that sometimes the greatest acts of protection are the ones that leave no trace, no mark, no explanation, only the quiet absence of what could have been. And as the door opened and the warmth of the room reached him, he carried that understanding with him, not as a question, but as a certainty, that somewhere between instinct and faith, between silence and trust, there exists a moment when everything changes without ever needing to be seen. And the only reason you walk away from it is because something beside you chose to listen when you could not.